England by David Hume. Edward I from 1272 to 1307. Chapter 1. The English were as yet so little inured to the obedience under a regular government, that the death of almost every king since the conquest has been attended with disorders. And the council, reflecting on the recent civil wars, and on the animosities which naturally remain after these great convulsions, had reason to apprehend dangerous consequences from the absence of the son and successor of Henry. They therefore hastened to proclaim Prince Edward, to swear allegiance to him, and to summon the states of the kingdom, in order to provide for the public peace in this important conjuncture. Walter Giffard, Archbishop of York, the Earl of Cornwall, son of Richard, King of the Romans, and the Earl of Gloucester were appointed guardians of the realm, and proceeded peaceably to the exercise of their authority, without either meeting with opposition from any of the people, or being disturbed with emulation and faction among themselves. The high character acquired by Edward during the late commotions, his military genius, his success in subduing the rebels, his moderation in settling the kingdom, had procured him great esteem, mixed with affection among all orders of men, and no one could reasonably entertain hopes of making any advantage of his absence, or of raising disturbance in the nation. The Earl of Gloucester himself, whose great power and turbulent spirit had excited most jealousy, was forward to give proofs of his allegiance, and the other malcontents, being destitute a leader, were obliged to remain in submission to the government. Prince Edward had reached Sicily in his return from the Holy Land, when he received intelligence of the death of his father, and he discovered a deep concern on the occasion. At the same time he learned the death of an infant son, John, whom his princess, Eleanor of Castile, had borne him at Acca, in Palestine, and as he appeared much less affected with that misfortune, the King of Sicily expressed a surprise at this difference of sentiment, but was told by Edward that the death of a son was a loss which he might hope to repair. The death of a father was a loss irreparable. Edward proceeded homeward, but as he soon learned the quiet settlement of the kingdom, he was in no hurry to take possession of the throne, but spent near a year in France before he made his appearance in England. In his passage by Chalons in Burgundy, 1273, he was challenged by the prince of the country to a tournament which he was preparing, and as Edward excelled in those martial and dangerous exercises, the true image of war, he declined not the opportunity of acquiring honour in that great assembly of the neighbouring nobles. But the image of war was here unfortunately turned into the thing itself. Edward and his retinue were so successful in their jousts that the French knights, provoked at their superiority, made a serious attack upon them, which was repulsed, and much blood was idly shed in the quarrel. This encounter received the name of the Petty Battle of Chalons. Edward went from Chalons to Paris, and did homage to Philip for the dominions which he held in France. He thence returned to Guienne, 1274, and settled in this province, which was in some confusion. He made his journey to London through France. In his passage he accommodated at Montreal a difference with Margaret, Countess of Flanders, heiress of that territory. He was received with joyful acclamations by his people, and was solemnly crowned at Westminster on 19th of August by Robert, Archbishop of Canterbury. The civil administration of the king. The king immediately applied himself to the re-establishment of his kingdom, and to the correcting of those disorders which the civil commotions and the loose administration of his father had introduced into every part of government. The plan of his policy was equally generous and prudent. He considered the great barons both as the immediate rivals of the crown and oppressors of the people, and he purposed, by an exact distribution of justice and a rigid execution of the laws, to give at once protection to the inferior orders of the state, and to diminish the arbitrary power of the great, on which their dangerous authority was chiefly founded. Making it a rule in his own conduct to observe, except on extraordinary occasions, the privileges secured to them by the Great Charter, he acquired a right to insist upon their observance of the same charter towards their vassals and inferiors, and he made the crown be regarded by all the gentry and commonalty of the kingdom as the foundation of justice and the general asylum against oppression. Besides enacting several useful statutes in a parliament which he summoned at Westminster on the 16th of February 1275, he took care to inspect the conduct of all his magistrates and judges, to displace such as were either negligent or corrupt, to provide them with sufficient force for the exertion of justice, to extirpate all bands and confederacies of robbers, and to repress the more silent robberies which were committed either by the power of the nobles or under the countenance of public authority. By this rigid administration, the face of the kingdom was soon changed, and order and justice took place of violence and oppression. But amidst the excellent institutions and public-spirited plans of Edward, there still appears somewhat both of the severity of his personal character and the prejudices of the times. As the various kinds of malefactors, the murderers, robbers, incendiaries, ravishers, and plunderers, had become so numerous and powerful that the ordinary ministers of justice, especially in the western counties, were afraid to execute laws against them, the king found it necessary to provide an extraordinary remedy for the evil, and he erected a new tribunal, which, however useful, would have been deemed, in times of more regular liberty, a great stretch of illegal and arbitrary power. It consisted of commissioners who were employed to inquire into disorders and crimes of all kinds, and to inflict the proper punishments upon them. The officers charged with this unusual commission made their circuit throughout the counties of England most infested with this evil, and carried terror into all the parts of the kingdom. In their zeal to punish crimes, they did not sufficiently distinguish between the innocent and the guilty. The smallest suspicion became a ground of accusation and trial. The slightest evidence was received against criminals. Prisons were crowded with malefactors, real or pretended. Severe fines were levied for small offences, and the king, though his exhausted exchequer was supplied by this expedient, found it necessary to stop the course of so great rigour, and after terrifying and dissipating by this tribunal the gangs of disorderly people in England, he prudently annulled the commission, and never afterwards renewed it. Among the various disorders to which the kingdom was subject, no one was more universally complained of than the adulteration of coin, and as this crime required more art than the English of that age, who chiefly employed force and violence in their iniquities, were possessed of, the imputation fell upon the Jews. Edward also seems to have indulged a strong prepossession against that nation, and this ill-judged zeal for Christianity being naturally augmented by the expedition to the Holy Land, he let loose the whole rigour of his justice against that unhappy people. 280 of them were hanged at once for this crime in London alone, besides those who suffered in other parts of the kingdom. The houses and lands, for the Jews had of late ventured to make purchases of that kind, as well as the goods of great multitudes, were sold and confiscated, and the king, lest it should be suspected that the riches of the sufferers were the chief part of their guilt, ordered a moiety of the money raised by these confiscations to be set apart and bestowed upon such as were willing to be converted to Christianity. But the resentment was more prevalent with them than any temptation from their poverty, and very few of them could be induced by interest to embrace the religion of their persecutors. The miseries of this people did not here terminate. Though the arbitrary talliages and exactions levied upon them had yielded a constant and considerable revenue to the crown, Edward, prompted by his zeal and his rapacity, resolved some time after to purge the kingdom entirely of that hated race, and to seize to himself at once their whole property as the reward of his labour. He left them only money sufficient to bear their charges into foreign countries, where new persecutions and extortions awaited them. But the inhabitants of the Cinque Ports, imitating the bigotry and avidity of their sovereign, despoiled most of them of this small pittance, and even threw many of them into the sea, a crime for which the king, who was determined to be the sole punisher in his dominions, inflicted a capital punishment upon them. No less than 15,000 Jews were at this time robbed of their effects and banished the kingdom. Very few of that nation have since lived in England, and as it is possible for a nation to subsist without lenders of money, and as it is impossible for a nation to subsist without lenders of money, and none will lend without a compensation, the practice of usury, as it was then called, was thenceforth exercised by the English themselves upon their fellow citizens, or by Lombards and other foreigners. What utter nonsense, Hume, you don't need usury, but I'll continue. It is very much to be questioned whether the dealings of these new usurers were equally open and unexceptional with those of the old. By a law of Richard, it was enacted that 3 copies should be made of every bond given to a Jew, one to be put into the hand of a public magistrate, another into those of a man of credit, and a third to remain with the Jew himself. But as the canon law, sounded by the municipal, permitted no Christian to take interest, all transactions of this kind must, after the banishment of the Jews, have become more secret and clandestine, and the lender of consequence be paid both for the use of his money and for the infamy and danger which he incurred by lending it. My own personal footnote, or they just didn't lend with interest, full stop. But, sorry, I have a bugbear about that. The great poverty of the crown, though no excuse, was probably the cause of this egregious tyranny exercised against the Jews. It's also false. But Edward also practised other more honourable means of remedying that evil. He employed a strict frugality in the management and distribution of his revenue. He engaged the Parliament to vote him a 15th of all movables, the Pope to grant him a 10th of all ecclesiastical revenues for 3 years, and the merchants to consent to a perpetual imposition of half a mark on every sack of wool exported, and a mark on 300 skins. He also issued commissions to inquire into all encroachments of the royal demesne, into the value of escheats, forfeitures, and wardships, and into the means of repairing or improving every branch of the revenue. The commissioners, in the execution of their office, began to carry matters too far against the nobility, and to question titles to estates which had been transmitted from father to son for several generations. Earl Warren, who had done such eminent service in the late reign, being required to show titles, drew his sword, and subjoined that William the Bastard had not conquered the kingdom for himself alone. His ancestor was a joint adventurer in the enterprise, and he himself was determined to maintain what had from that period remained unquestioned in his family. The king, sensible of the danger, desisted from making further inquiries of this nature. The Conquest of Wales, 1276. But the active spirit of Edward could not long remain without employment. He soon after undertook an enterprise more prudent for himself and more advantageous to his people. Lewin, Prince of Wales, had been deeply engaged with the Mountfort faction, had entered into all their conspiracies against the crown, and frequently fought on their side, until the Battle of Evesham, so fatal to that party, had employed every expedient to depress the royal cause, and to promote the success of the barons. In the general accommodation made with the vanquished, Llewellyn had also obtained his pardon. But as he was the most powerful, and therefore the most obnoxious vassal of the crown, he had reason to entertain anxiety about his situation, and to dread the future effect of resentment and jealousy in the English monarch. For this reason he determined to provide for his security by maintaining a secret correspondence with his former associates, and he even made his address to a daughter of the Earl of Leicester, who was sent to him from beyond the sea, but being intercepted in her passage near the Isle of Sicily, was detained in the court of England. This incident increasing the mutual jealousy between Edward and Llewellyn. The latter, when requiring to come to England and do homage to the new king, scrupled to put himself into the hands of an enemy, desired a safe conduct from Edward, insisted upon having the king's son and other noblemen delivered to him as hostages, and demanded that his consort should previously be set at liberty. The king, having now brought the state to a full settlement, was not displeased with this occasion of exercising his authority, and subduing entirely the Principality of Wales. He refused all Llewellyn's demands, except that of a safe conduct, sent him repeated summons to perform the duty of a vassal, levied an army to reduce him to obedience, obtained a new aid of a 15th from Parliament, and marched out with certain assurance of success against the enemy. Besides the great disproportion of force between the kingdom and the principality, the circumstances of the two states were entirely reversed. 1277. And the same intestine dissensions which had formerly weakened England now prevailed in Wales, and had even taken place in the reigning family. David and Roderick, brothers to Llewellyn, dispossessed of their inheritance by that prince, had been obliged to have recourse to the protection of Edward, and they seconded with all their interest, which was extensive, his attempts to enslave their native country. The Welsh prince had no resource but the inaccessible situation of his mountains, which had hitherto, through many ages, defended his forefathers against all attempts of the Saxon and Norman conquerors, and he retired among the hills of Snowdon, resolved to defend himself to the last extremity. But Edward, equally vigorous and cautious, entering by the north with a formidable army, pierced into the heart of the country, and having carefully explored every road before him, and secured every pass behind him, approached the Welsh army in its last retreat. He here avoided the putting to trial the valour of a nation proud of its ancient independence, and inflamed with animosity against its hereditary enemies. And he trusted to the slow but sure effects of famine for reducing that people to subjection. The rude and simple manner of the natives, as well as the mountainous situation of their country, had made them entirely neglect tillage, and trust to pasturage alone for their subsistence, a method of life which had hitherto secured them against the irregular attempts of the English, but exposed them to certain ruin when the conquest of the country was steadily pursued and prudently planned by Edward. Destitute of magazines, cooped up in a narrow corner, they, as well as their cattle, suffered all the rigours of famine, and Llewellyn, without being able to strike a stroke for his independence, was at last obliged to submit at discretion, and receive the terms imposed upon him by the victor. 19th of November. He bound himself to pay to Edward £50,000 as a reparation of damages, to do homage to the crown of England, to permit all the other barons of Wales, except four near Snowdon, to swear fealty to the same crown, to relinquish the country between Cheshire and the river Conway, to settle on his brother Roderick 1,000 marks a year, and on David 500, and to deliver 10 hostages as security for his future submission. Edward, on the performance of the other articles, remitted to the Prince of Wales the payment of the £50,000, which was stipulated by treaty, and which it is probable the poverty of the country made it absolutely impossible for him to levy. But notwithstanding this indulgence, complaints of iniquity soon arose on the side of the vanquished. The English, insolent on their easy and bloodless victory, oppressed the inhabitants of the districts which were yielded to them. The Lord Marchers committed with impunity all kinds of violence on their Welsh neighbours. New and more severe terms were imposed on Llewellyn himself, and Edward, when the prince attended him at Worcester, exacted a promise that he would retain no person in his principality who should be obnoxious to the English monarch. There were other personal insults which raised the indignation of the Welsh, and made them determine rather to encounter a force which they had already experienced to be so much superior, than to bear the oppression from the haughty victors. Prince David, seized with the national spirit, made peace with his brother, and promised to concur in the defence of public liberty. The Welsh fled to arms, and Edward, not displeased with the occasion of making his conquest final and absolute, assembled all his military tenants, and advanced into Wales with an army which the inhabitants could not reasonably hope to resist. The situation of the country gave the Welsh at first some advantage over Luke de Tunny, one of Edward's captains, who had passed the Manow with a detachment. But Llewellyn, being surprised by Mortimer, was defeated and slain in an action, and 2,000 of his followers were put to the sword. David, who succeeded him in the principality, could never collect an army sufficient to face the English, and being chased from hill to hill, and hunted from one retreat to another, was obliged to conceal himself under various disguises, and was at last betrayed in his lurking place to the enemy. Edward sent him in chains to Shrewsbury, and bringing him to a formal trial, 1283, before all the peers of England, ordered this sovereign prince to be hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor for defending by arms the liberties of his native country, together with his own hereditary authority. All the Welsh nobility submitted to the conqueror. The laws of England, with the sheriffs and other ministers of justice, were established in that principality, and though it was long before national antipathies were extinguished, and a thorough union attained between the people, yet this important conquest, which it had required 800 years fully to effect, was at last, through the abilities of Edward, completed by the English. The king, sensible that nothing kept alive the ideas of military valour and of ancient glory so much as the traditional poetry of the people, which, assisted by the power of music and the jollity of festivals, made deep impression on the minds of the youth, gathered all the Welsh bards, and from a barbarous, though not absurd policy, ordered them all to be put to death. There prevails a vulgar story, which, as it well suits the capacity of the monkish writers, is carefully recorded by them, which, by the way, will be read perhaps in another episode. It's Giraldus Cambrensis, who's one of my favourites. That Edward, assembling the Welsh, promised to give them a prince of unexceptionable manners, a Welshman by birth, and one who could speak no other language. On their acclamations of joy and promise of obedience, he invested in the principality his second son, Edward, then an infant, who had been born at Carnarvon. The death of his eldest son, Alfonso, soon after made young Edward heir of the monarchy. The Principality of Wales was fully annexed to the crown, and henceforth gives a title to the eldest son of the King of England. 1286. The settlement of Wales appeared so complete to Edward that in less than 2 years after he went abroad in order to make peace between Alfonso, the King of Aragon, and Philip the Fair, who had lately succeeded his father, Philip the Hardy, on the throne of France. Sorry, I read that in the wrong tone. I'll reread that sentence. The settlement of Wales appeared so complete to Edward that in less than 2 years after he went abroad, in order to make peace between Alfonso, the King of Aragon, and Philip the Fair, who had lately succeeded his father, Philip the Hardy, on the throne of France. The difference between these two princes had arisen about the kingdom of Sicily, which the Pope, after his hopes from England failed him, had bestowed on Charles, brother of St. Louis, and which was claimed on other titles by Peter, King of Aragon, father to Alfonso. Edward had powers from both princes to settle the terms of peace, and he succeeded in his endeavours. But as the controversy nowise regards England, we shall not enter into details of it. He stayed abroad above 3 years, and on his return found many disorders to have prevailed, both from open violence and from the corruption of justice. Thomas Chamberlain, a gentleman of some note, had assembled several of his associates at Boston, in Lincolnshire, under the pretence of holding a tournament, an exercise practised by the gentry only, but in reality with a view of plundering the rich fair of Boston and robbing the merchants. To facilitate his purpose, he privately set fire to the town, and while the inhabitants were employed in quenching the flames, the conspirators broke into the booths and carried off the goods. Chamberlain himself was detected and hanged, but maintained so steadily the point of honour to his accomplices that he could not be prevailed upon, by offers or promises, to discover any of them. Many other instances of robbery and violence broke out in all parts of England, though the singular circumstances attending this conspiracy have made it alone to be particularly recorded by historians. 1289. But the corruption of the judges, by which the fountains of justice were poisoned, seemed of still more dangerous consequence. Edward, in order to remedy this prevailing abuse, summoned a parliament and brought the judges to a trial, where all of them, except 2 who were clergymen, were convicted of this flagrant iniquity, were fined and deposed. The amount of fines levied upon them is alone a sufficient proof of their guilt, being above 100,000 marks, an immense sum in those days, and sufficient to defray the charges of an expensive war between 2 great kingdoms. The king afterwards made all the new judges swear that they would take no bribes, but his expedient of deposing and fining the old ones was the more effectual remedy. We now come to give an account of the state of the affairs in Scotland, which gave rise to the most interesting transactions of this reign, and of some of the subsequent. Though the intercourse of that kingdom with England, I just have to pause. Isn't this a remarkable reign? My goodness, he kicks out all the Jews, he changes the banking policy, he kicks out all the judges, he conquers the Welsh, and we're about an eighth of the way through. Sorry to interrupt, I'm too excited to read. I'm going to pause and calm myself down. Shame about the bards, though. The affairs of Scotland. Though the government of Scotland had been continually exposed to those factions and convulsions which are incident to all barbarous and to many civilized nations, and though the successions of their kings, the only part of their history which deserves any credit, had often been disordered by irregularities and usurpations, the true heir of the royal family had still in the end prevailed, and Alexander III, who had espoused the sister of Edward, probably inherited, after a period of about 800 years, and through a succession of males, the sceptre of all the Scottish princes who had governed that nation since its first establishment in that island. This prince died in 1286, by a fall from his horse at Kinghorn, without leaving any male issue, and without any descendant, except Margaret, born of Eric, King of Norway, and of Margaret, daughter of the Scottish monarch. This princess, commonly called the Maid of Norway, though a female and an infant, and a foreigner, yet being the lawful heir of the kingdom, had, through her grandfather's care, been recognised successor by the States of Scotland. And on Alexander's death, the dispositions which had been previously made against that event appeared so just and prudent that no disorders, as might naturally be apprehended, ensued in the kingdom. Margaret was acknowledged Queen of Scotland. 5 guardians, the Bishop of St. Andrews and Glasgow, the Earls of Fife and Buchan, and James, Steward of Scotland, entered peaceably upon the administration, and the infant princess, under the protection of Edward, her great-uncle, and Eric, her father, who exerted themselves on this occasion, seemed firmly seated on the throne of Scotland. The English monarch was naturally led to build mighty projects on this incident, and having lately by force of arms brought Wales under subjection, he attempted by the marriage of Margaret, with his eldest son, Edward, to unite the whole island into one monarchy, and thereby to give it security both against domestic convulsions and foreign invasions. 1290. The amity which had of late prevailed between the two nations, and which, even in former times, had never been interrupted by any violent wars or injuries, facilitated extremely the execution of this project, so favourable to the happiness and grandeur of both kingdoms, and the States of Scotland readily gave their assent to the English proposals, and even agreed that their young sovereign should be educated in the court of Edward. Anxious, however, for the liberty and independency of their country, they took care to stipulate very equitable conditions, ere they trusted themselves to the hands of so great and so ambitious a monarch. It was agreed that they should enjoy all their ancient laws, liberties, and customs, that in case young Edward and Margaret should die without issue, the crown of Scotland should revert to the next heir, and should be inherited by him free and independent, that the military tenants of the crown should never be obliged to go out of Scotland in order to do homage to the sovereign of the United Kingdoms, nor the ink's faded, nor the chapters of cathedral, collegiate, or convental churches, in order to make elections, that the parliaments summoned for Scottish affairs should always be held within the bounds of that kingdom, and that Edward should bind himself, under the penalty of 100,000 marks, payable to the Pope for the use of holy wars, to observe all these articles. It is not easy to conceive that the two nations could have treated more on a foot of equality than Scotland and England maintained during the whole course of this transaction. And though Edward gave his assent to the article concerning the future independency of the Scottish crown, with savouring of his former rights, this reserve gave no alarm to the nobility of Scotland, both because these rights, having hitherto been little heard of, had occasioned no disturbance, and because the Scots had so near a prospect of seeing them entirely absorbed in the rights of their own sovereignty. Competition for the crown of Scotland, 1291. But this project, so happily formed, and so amicably conducted, failed of success, and by the sudden death of the Norwegian princess, who expired on her passage to Scotland, and left a very dismal prospect to the kingdom. Though disorders were for the present obviated by the authority of the regency formerly established, the succession itself of the crown was now become an object of dispute, and the regents could not expect that a controversy, which is not usually decided by reason and argument alone, should be peaceably settled by them, or even by the states of the kingdom, amidst so many powerful pretenders. The posterity of William, King of Scotland, the prince taken prisoner by Henry II, being all extinct by the death of Margaret of Norway, the right of the crown devolved on the issue of David, Earl of Huntingdon, brother to William, whose male line being also extinct, left the succession open to the posterity of his daughters. The Earl of Huntingdon had 3 daughters: Margaret, married to Alan, Lord of Galloway; Isabella, wife of Robert Bruce, or Bruce, Lord of Annandale; or Amada, who espoused Henry, Lord Hastings. Margaret, the eldest of the sisters, left one daughter, Devigilda, married to John Balliol, by whom she had a son of the same name, one of the present competitors for the crown. Isabella the second bore a son, Robert Bruce, who was now alive, and also insisted on his claim. Amada the third left a son, John Hastings, who pretended that the kingdom of Scotland, like many other inheritances, was divisible among the 3 daughters of the Earl of Huntingdon, and that he, in right of his mother, had a title to a third of it. Balliol and Bruce united against Hastings in maintaining that the kingdom was indivisible, but each of them, supported by plausible reasons, asserted the preference of his own title. Balliol was sprung from the elder branch. Bruce was one degree nearer the common stock. If the principle of representation was regarded, the former had the better claim. If propinquity was considered, the latter was entitled to preference. The sentiments of men were divided. All the nobility had taken part on one side or the other. The people followed implicitly their leaders. The 2 claimants themselves had great power and numerous retainers in Scotland, and it is no wonder that, among a rude people, more accustomed to arms than inured to laws, a controversy of this nature, which could not be decided by any former precedent among them, and which is capable of exciting commotions in the most legal and best established governments, should threaten the state with the most fatal convulsions. Each century had its peculiar mode in conducting business, and men, guided more by custom than by reason, follow without inquiry the manners which are prevailing in their own time. The practice of that age, in controversies between states and princes, seems to have been to choose a foreign prince as an equal arbiter, by whom the question was decided, and whose sentence prevented those dismal confusions and disorders inseparable at all times from war, but which were multiplied 100-fold and dispersed into every corner by the nature of the feudal governments. It was thus that the English king and barons, in the preceding reign, had endeavoured to compose their dissensions by reference to the King of France, and the celebrated integrity of that monarch had prevented all the bad effects which might naturally have been dreaded from so perilous an expedient. It was thus that the kings of France and Aragon, and afterwards other princes, had submitted their controversies to Edward's judgment, and the remoteness of their states, the great power of the princes, and the little interest which he had on either side, had induced him to acquit himself with honour in his decisions. The Parliament of Scotland, therefore, threatened with a furious civil war, and allured by the great reputation of the English monarch, as well as by the present amicable correspondence between the kingdoms, agreed in making a reference to Edward, and Fraser, a bishop of St. Andrews, with other deputies, was sent to notify to him their resolution, and to claim his good offices in the present dangers to which they were exposed. His inclination, they flattered themselves, led him to prevent their dissensions, and to interpose with a power which none of the competitors would dare to withstand. When this expedient was proposed by one party, the other deemed it dangerous to object to it. Indifferent persons thought that the imminent perils of a civil war would thereby be prevented, and no one reflected on the ambitious character of Edward, and the almost certain ruin which must attend a small state, divided by faction, when it thus implicitly submits itself to the will of so powerful and encroaching a neighbour. Thank you for listening to part 1. Up next will be the continuation of his quarrel with Scotland, and then the war with France, and the rest of it, of course. Thank you.